The Bite Show is listener supported at thebiteshow.com. Follow us on Twitter at The Bite Show.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. And we are really blessed to have with us Joseph P. Farrell. And you can email Joseph at Vardas, VARDAS 3 at AOL.com. Visit Joseph's website, GizaDeathStar.com. And also get his books. The Giza Death Star. Okay, that's one book there. The Giza Death Star Deployed. That's book number 2. And also we have the Giza Death Star Destroyed. We have Reich of the Black Sun and the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics and Ancient Texts. And Joseph is a very prolific writer. And what a brain. Oh my goodness, you are gifted, Joseph. Really. Tonight we're going to begin Cosmic War Part 3. And we're going to talk about all kinds of things going on. You know, Joseph, they are bringing out a remake of War of the Worlds.
Oh, yes, I would imagine.
Yeah, I just think it's kind of interesting.
They had one a few years ago with Tom Cruise, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, they're going to bring out
yet another one, huh?
Yeah, they must be getting ready, close to something, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree.
Well, okay. We know about NASA. Mm-hmm. What do we know about that space station up there? Anything?
Well, that's really out of my purview. I really wouldn't be able to comment on it. Someone like Richard Hoagland would be better, but I find it just tremendously curious.
Yeah.
That after the Apollo moon mission's successes,
yes,
that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union, which have certainly possessed for any number of years the technology to go back to the moon, have never done so, and that the United States for approximately 25 years has been more or less dithering around with the space shuttle technology, which, as of this date as we speak, is a terribly outmoded, almost obsolete, if certainly obsolescent technology, and that we have confined our manned space activity to low Earth, close Earth orbit activities. We have not launched anything spectacular in the sense of manned missions since those Apollo missions, and I'm rather suspicious. And hello?
Yes, you're okay.
And I've always been suspicious that the Soviet Union and the Russians, after Apollo, never went there themselves with a manned mission. They certainly could have. So I've found this whole this whole aspect of the space program extremely puzzling.
Well, I think there may be somebody up there that doesn't want us up there.
Well, that's always been kind of the take that people have had, and I'm certainly coming more and more to that position because there just is something inexplicable, something that just does not jive with the fact that we have just more or less tabled any long-term manned spaceflight commitments, and
at least publicly.
At least publicly, correct.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and it's also interesting that an article came out the other day, Joseph, that talked about experiments that they do in outer space.
Right.
And that when they bring the germs back,
Right.
they are far more infectious
Yes.
than they were before they took them off the planet.
Interesting.
Yeah. I thought,
Very interesting.
Yeah. Very strange stuff. Okay. In your book, Cosmic Wars, you talk about multi-vectorial entities, electromagnetic fields and waves.
Right.
Okay, and I was asking you, is this used or can this be used for mind control?
Yes, it can. This is an aspect of what has popularly come to be called scalar physics. Now, I want to say a few words about this because there is a certain, I would say school out there that says that scalar physics doesn't exist. And what these people will do is point out that within the type of mathematics that is normally used with this type of physics, a scalar is a name, a technical name within mathematics for a particular kind of thing. It's really a dimensionless, pure magnitude, if you will. But what most of these people are unaware of is that there were two papers published prior to special relativity by Albert Einstein in 1905. And these two papers, I believe, were published in 1903. I'm not quite certain of the year, but I think it was a couple of years prior to the appearance of special relativity. They were papers by the English physicist E.T. Whittaker, who, if you study the history of physics, is a fairly well-known name. He was certainly a brilliant man. The papers are both highly mathematical, but in them, what he does is he takes what physicists call the scalar potential, which is again, an expression of this mathematical language. And what he does is he breaks it down, he analyzes it into constituent elements, which turn out to be longitudinal waves, which are, again, if you'll recall from our first lecture, or our first session, or whatever you want to call it, are really kind of pressure waves, like sound waves, only they occur in the fabric of space-time itself. In other words, they're areas of compression within space-time, and of course that would imply areas of rarefaction. So what he does is he analyzes the electromagnetic scalar potential into pairs of these bidirectional longitudinal waves, each moving in exactly the opposite direction from each other. So what he comes up with is really this multivectorial entity, which sums, in the mathematical language, which sums to a zero translation vector, which, to put it in plain English, is just a fancy way of saying a translation or a traveling of something from one point to another. So in other words, these things don't travel anywhere, but yet they produce a stress at a certain point within the fabric of space-time. So that's really what is going on when someone refers to scalar physics. Now, you asked the question about, is this related to mind control?
Yeah.
It most definitely is, because in the theorizing on this type of physics, which has largely been done by a retired U.S. Army officer by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden. He's wrote many books, many papers on this particular physics. And what he does is he says that, you can imagine a variety of systems where you have a set of vectors that rotate. Let's say that we have a hexagonal system with 6 vectors all rotating in the same direction. Well, in terms of a translation vector, there's no translation, and so nothing really, if we look at it from the standpoint of a certain kind of mathematical language that is used most popularly to model these types of systems, nothing is really occurring. If we take a similar system, a triangle, and imagine each side of the triangle is a vector, draw an arrow, and it's rotating in the same direction, it too is a zero translation vectorial system. And yet the triangle and the hexagon will be different systems in terms of their stress, in terms, in other words, of their internal geometry.
Okay.
So scientists in the Soviet Union began calling this distinction of stresses in the medium a information content in the field. That's what they mean by it. It's this internal geometry of stress and the vectors that compose it. And if we look at that system, what it really becomes is a kind of a template for action. And you can impose that template by interfering electromagnetic waves on a particular region. Now, interference means to have two or more electromagnetic waves or beams of waves all converging at a particular region. And what they will do is they'll set up an interference pattern. It's just like throwing several rocks into a pond and then watching the ripples all kind of merge with each other and create these intricate patterns. Well, every time you do that, you're going to come up with a slightly different pattern of interference waves. Well, you can do the same thing with electromagnetic interference. And it will create a particular pattern of these interfered waves. And that pattern itself, the wave pattern itself, you'll notice, is more or less stationary. It sort of is just there. And that wave pattern itself becomes a template that will affect things like physiology and therefore emotion, consciousness, and so on and so forth. So you can get very specific with this stuff, and it is directly related to this idea of electromagnetic manipulation of emotional states and of consciousness.
Over large
area. You can configure this stuff depending on what sort of equipment you have available, of course. But, pardon me, you can configure this stuff to affect any region that you desire. You can use it over very large regions, very small regions. You can configure it at very high power or very low power. And if you are wanting to affect emotional states, if you have the requisite data bank of what sort of templates will produce what sorts of emotional states, then of course you can manipulate those things as well.
Well, is there a way or a technology accessible to people whereby they could identify, the signature?
Well, the signatures of this stuff, scalar physics, the theory behind it, and from all appearances, the practical applications that it affords are so multifaceted and various that you can construe it to do a great number of things. But one of the most, to my mind, one of the most evident signatures of its use would be in the occurrence of certain types of earthquakes that occur in close proximity to major political events.
Oh, yeah.
Or that would seem to cluster in certain areas at certain magnitudes, at certain depths within the crust or mantle of the earth, and so on and so forth. These things have to be looked at very carefully, but I should point out that this is a very dangerous area of physics to start tinkering with in your garage. I don't recommend that people do it.
No fooling. Wow. Well, if somebody felt that they were having thoughts
yes.
that were not their own, or, originating from within themselves,
right.
If they had the ability to distinguish something like that, how could they protect themselves? Is there a way?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think that the principal way to do or to protect oneself against this type of weaponry is, first of all, the ability to recognize, precisely as you say, when one is having thoughts occurring repeatedly externally, just as if they're bombarding you, or emotional states that appear for no good reason. You're not clinically depressed or anything like that,
right.
or things of this sort, and that appear for no good reason and appear over time. And I would think the best way to protect oneself is the good old tried and true method of prayer. because there is an element always within each human being of their own individual will, which ultimately no amount of technology is capable of eradicating or of reducing or anything of the sort. So that would be my principal recommendation.
Well, that's a good one. Another thing is that these kind of technologies that attach themselves or penetrate one's brain, thoughts, whatever, they could train on somebody, where a person just keeps having, like playing a tape in their head.
Right.
Somehow the brain just latches onto it, and it just repeats like a tape over and over. And I know there's a word for that, and I can't think of it at the moment.
Well, I don't know that this physics has been pursued to the ability to do those types of things. I really don't. Again, it would be a matter of theoretical speculation. From what I've read in terms of mind manipulation by electromagnetic means, that ability isn't there yet, although they are getting extraordinarily close. But in most of the cases that I've read, they still have to have the physical presence of some artifact of technology actually in or on the person that they're trying to manipulate. Scalar physics does not require that, but by the same token, that would mean that it would be much less specific in the types of things that it would be able to accomplish in terms of induced emotional states and so on.
Well, now, can they do this from a satellite?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
But what you would require, what is always important to bear in mind with this type of physics, is that it requires the interference of two or more beams of electromagnetic energy on a particular region. So that requires, if you're dealing with an antenna array, it would require something like a phased antenna array. If you were dealing with satellites, then it would require two or more things of that sort, or at least a satellite with its own very large phased array. But it's an area of investigation. This electromagnetic means of manipulation or induction of emotional states or for that matter, certain physiological states at a distance. This is something that Bearden has pointed out was largely research that was undertaken in the Soviet Union. And for that reason, it remains more or less highly classified.
Is it possible that a person can walk into a field like this?
It would depend very much on the strength of the field.
Yeah.
Let's use a simple analogy here. Let's take the case of iron filings. If we dump iron filings onto a piece of paper or sprinkle them onto a piece of paper, they're going to be more or less amorphous. There's not going to be any recognizable shape or structure to them. That's just going to be a clump of iron filings.
Right.
But if we put a magnet under those iron filings, then they will take a distinct and recognizable shape along the vectors of the fields of force of the magnet. Now, scalar interferometry, since what you're really doing is creating one of these sets of standing longitudinal waves in the medium of space-time itself, you could conceivably, and this again is just merely theoretical speculation, but you could conceivably, with a field strong enough, solidify an invisible column of air, or even in vacuum space create quite literally a kind of a virtual mass, which if you ran into it with sufficient force would simply vaporize you.
Yeah.
So in other words, this is very potent and I want to stress, very flexible stuff. What you want to do with it really determines how you configure the physics and the technology of your device itself, but it's all coming from more or less the same area.
Because I've heard of people that have felt as though they literally walked into a field and suddenly it felt very different.
Yes, that's quite possible.
You know.
That's quite possible.
And it's very disturbing.
Yes, it's quite possible.
Well, you, in talking about these gods with small g,
right?
They had weapons.
Oh yes.
Okay. What weapons did they have back then that we might have today?
Well, from my suppositions that I make in the three Giza Death Star books, and then again in the Cosmic War, in looking at the texts as they describe these things, I come to at least three conclusions in increasing order of power and sophistication. The first would be the obvious one, that they would have had access to nuclear weapons, nuclear and thermonuclear weapons, which basically is atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. The second level would be some sort of weapon based on the ability to direct tremendous streams of electrostatic energy, or even, if you will, plasmas, across great distances. And the third level, the final level, and the highest level of sophistication and destructive power would be precisely these scalar weapons themselves. And the reason I stress this, or if one prefers another way of explaining this type of physics, some sort of torsion-based weapon, because when one gets into the physics of all of this stuff, one can come at it from a variety of slightly different angles and use slightly different models to explain what may be going on in these ancient texts. But for me, the fundamental fact, and this I try and bring out at great length in the Cosmic War, the fundamental fact of the solar system is that there is an exploded planet that we now call the asteroid belt in it. There was once a planet which is now no longer there. And there is no really good or adequate physics model, to my mind, which would explain why that occurred on the basis of natural causes.
Yeah.
And even Tom Van Flandern, who advanced or kind of revived the exploded planet hypothesis in the 20th century, made a similar series of statements in his own book as he was wrestling with this problem, in that all the data of modern astronomy points to the exploded planet as having actually having occurred. But when he came to explain why it occurred, the models that he used were oftentimes very, very speculative and have their own problems. The models that he's tried to explain them with have almost as many problems as the alternatives that he's trying to overturn within astronomy. But he does mention, as kind of a last resort, as it were, that it may have been exploded, in his words, by deliberate action. In other words, in an act of war. So if we look at that possibility, then we have to have a physics sufficiently powerful enough, at least in theory, to do that. And the only physics that I can find, at least in the modern literature, that would be sufficiently powerful enough to do that, if there was a sufficient energy source empowering it, would be precisely this scalar physics, or if you prefer the other slightly different alternative, torsion physics. So that would be my explanation as to what sort of weapons these ancient gods used. And I would add one more category to that, although I don't get into it to any great extent in the Cosmic War, and that would be genetically based weapons.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very interesting that you say that, because in Scripture where they send the spies into the Promised Land, and they come back and they say, oh, we're like grasshoppers before them, and it takes 2 men to carry, the grapes, a huge cluster of grapes. And when when I read that, I think, aha, GM grapes for GM people.
Right. Right. And, that raises the other thing that is talked about in the Old Testament and some of this other ancient literature, and that is that some of these people were of much larger physiology than modern man, or even, for that matter, mankind as he was back in the classical era, which was considerably shorter than he is now. But again, genetics, I think, is definitely in the arsenal. It's definitely in play. And I do talk to a certain extent in the Giza Death Star Destroyed about the fact that in the Babylonian epic, the Enuma Elish, which to my mind is really not a creation epic at all, as most modern scholars refer to it. It's a war epic. And in that epic, the villainess in the story, her name is Tiamat, actually, if you read it from a literal point of view, is employing genetic hybrids, chimeras, as part of her arsenal. So again, this, if we read it from the standpoint that this is actually a description of a once existing science, as I do, then this is what's in play. It's a very profound and sophisticated genetics.
Well, the UK just came out a couple of days ago with an Art News article that they've given me green light for the scientists to go ahead and create anything.
Right, I've heard that, yes.
Yeah, very disturbing. Again,
yes, it is.
Because I think that kind of thing has been going on for quite a while.
Oh, I do too. It's certainly been in our modern literature since Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and things, novels and things of that sort. So certainly it's science is catching up to the ancient epics and modern science fiction.
Well, I think public science is catching up. I think there's a lot of things that go on in private labs, black budget funding, that type of thing.
Right.
I think there's a lot of things that go on in there that would just horrify us.
Right, I would agree.
But with these giants, now they have found all over the world, remains, skeletons, mummies, huge coffins or sarcophagus of these people. And we have found weird artifacts in coal seams that we can hardly believe would be there. Things that gears.
Right.
And the coal seam is 1 million years old. What about that?
Well, in the Cosmic War, I point out that one of the postulates or components of Van Flanderen's exploded planet hypothesis is that the missing planet, which interestingly enough was named Krypton by 19th century astronomers, but that the exploded planet was of the same approximate mass as the modern-day planet Saturn. So in other words, it was a very massive body, but it was apparently solid. So this would have made it a solid planetary body, much larger than the Earth. And if we speculate for a moment that this planet was once home to intelligent human-like life, then it is highly likely that life would have had much larger physiologies simply to offset the stronger and much more powerful gravitation on the surface of the planet. So I find it very interesting that the ancient myths that are recorded in Sumeria and then that are also repeated in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, record the fact that the offspring of the Anunnaki or the Nephilim or of the sons of God, in other words, that came down and intermarried or interbred with the daughters of men, were giants. They were structurally and physiologically much larger than normal human beings. And this would stand to reason if their point of origin within the cosmos was a planet such as I have described. Now, it's also interesting that these giants, I talk about this subject in one chapter in the Cosmic War. It's also interesting that many of these giants had 6 fingers and toes.
Yes.
In other words, there was a predominant presence of sexadigitism in a lot of these remains. And many of them also had double dentition. In other words, they had double rows of teeth, which is an interesting thing in itself, because there is an expression, I believe, in the Old Testament that says that the spies that were sent into the land of Canaan to spy it out prior to the ancient Hebrews going into the conquest of it, there's an expression that the land eateth up the inhabitants thereof. And I've always kind of understood that, or taken it to mean that the practice of cannibalism was very rampant amongst these giant tribes and so on. So, the idea of double dentition might find some sort of expression in this practice. I don't know if there's a relationship or not, but it's something I certainly speculate on. So I think, this is another component in my argument, that we cannot look at these ancient myths as do certain catastrophists like Alan Alford, who's probably the premier exponent of that school. We cannot look at these myths as being nothing more than metaphors for the exploded planet itself. Because if that were the case, then things like giant remains and so on shouldn't exist on this planet, or for that matter, anywhere else. So there's some sort of loose corroboration. In other words, that I'm maintaining that these things are evidence that we have to take these ancient myths a lot more seriously in terms of their literal truth than we're accustomed to doing thus far.
I agree. And when we talk about Mars, I know Stuart Best produced a video about this, and it is astounding, Joseph, based on the films and things that were on the NASA website, with very little clarification. You can see structures, and statues and things like that. Then in Scripture, there's mention of, they built their nest in the stars, etc., etc. And they were thrown down from their nest and this and that. And I mean, there's a lot of hints, clues, here and there throughout all literature, even in the Bible, about people, for lack of a better word, living somewhere else aside from the earth.
Right.
I think Richard Hoagland brought up the picture of the Sphinx on Mars.
Yes.
Fascinating.
I believe it was. I believe that the one that did that was actually the co-author of his new book, Mike Barra, that analyzed that very strange picture that one of their surface probes had returned to NASA. It does. There is a kind of a Sphinx-like looking shape off in the distance against the backdrop of a Martian hill. And it is very peculiar looking in that it does have almost the exact outlines of the Sphinx in Egypt. But, it goes to more than that. If one accepts, for the sake of argument, that Mr. Hoagland's hypothesis concerning the face on Mars at the region of Cydonia is an actual artificial structure, and one looks at it in terms of a morphology that has two very different underlying components, a feline and an ape-like form or presence. And I show this in the Cosmic War, that when you flip each side over, you will clearly see the resemblances, even in the latest NASA pictures. So again, I think that the fact that we're dealing with a common sort of cultural matrix between Mars and the Earth is yet another indicator that we're in the presence of perhaps an ancient civilization that was interplanetary in nature.
Well, why do they suppress this? I mean, they say that it would just upset the heck out of religious people. I mean, I don't think it would.
I think, I do think that there is a certain strain within Christianity, particularly in American Christianity, of the extreme sort of fundamentalist that would react negatively to it. But I don't think that reaction would be a sufficient basis to explain why they are covering things up. I think that's more or less an excuse that they give. Because Christianity, one can read the Church Fathers or the medieval scholastics, and the big name theologians from those periods of history are just full of all sorts of extremely intriguing speculations on the nature of angels and how they exist and what they are.
Oh, yes.
So, it's not as if Christianity is really talking about anything new when it considers alternative life forms. That's something that I think people have foisted off onto it that really haven't done their theological homework.
And since when did they become so sensitive to the Christians?
Well, yes, that's another thing. I raise my eyebrows when the theologically illiterate begin expostulating about what the reaction of Christians is going to be.
Right.
But in terms of what their motivations would actually be for covering these things up, I think principally one has to speculate in two directions. And the first is that it has got to be apparent if indeed Mr. Hoagland's hypotheses of artifacts on the Moon and Mars and elsewhere in the solar system is correct, and that they really do know these things and really do see these things, then a civilization that can leave those kinds of artifacts might also have left artifacts of its technology. And therefore, whoever gets there first has a monopoly, potentially, on a very sophisticated and very powerful technology. So I think that has got to be motivation number one. Motivation number two is that it is also possible, if we grant the first hypothesis, motivation number one, then we have to grant the possibility that some of those people that left those artifacts may still be around somewhere, and that perhaps they have been in contact with them at whatever level, and that secrecy, for whatever reason, may be a requirement of that contact, either on their part or on our part, I don't know, but that it somehow enters into the so to speak, the contractual obligations that contact brings about. Again, that's pure speculation, but I think it's a rational one based on the first hypothesis, for which I do think that there is a great deal of prima facie evidence.
Yeah. Well, to that I would add that Scripture talks about the great deception, where people will believe things, and you can almost see them setting this up. Look, they created you. It was them.
Right.
God didn't create you. There is no God. They are the gods. I can just see something like that rising up, and they're really laying the groundwork for it. They've been laying the groundwork for it for a long time.
Well, again, it's yet another form of materialism, but it's very easily combated. Let's say we grant, for the sake of argument, that the Sumerian story of the creation of mankind out of other beings by some sort of genetic manipulation really was what led to humanity. That still leaves the fact to be explained that the beings creating mankind have enough intelligence to do it. Yeah. So we are not advancing the argument that they want to advance any further than it already has been. We're simply adding different details to the mix. It does not change the nature of the argument itself, either philosophically on their part or theologically on the part of any world religion that has a stake in the other view. So, again, it's really more of an argument that can only appeal to the people that are theologically illiterate to begin with, who want to believe in some form of materialism and grasp at any straw that they want in order to maintain that worldview.
Well, if you look at God Almighty as the creator of man, He created two people, and then it got screwed up. Genetically and every other way. We are told that Noah was perfect in his generations, but it doesn't say his wife was.
Well, there is an interesting thing that I bring out or allude to in the Cosmic War. And that is that if we look at the story of the Nephilim, which is first recounted in Genesis chapter 6, it does not really indicate when this activity began. And I also produce one of Lawrence Gardner's genealogical charts in that book simply for the purpose of illustrating the fact that if we look at it from the Sumerian point of view, that intermingling of that other human-like life form began with Adam and Eve themselves, not necessarily with those two viewed with each other, but with those two as being the spouse of some one of these other human-like life forms. So in other words, there's actually three different lines that one is dealing with if one looks at Gardner's reconstructions carefully. One is dealing with a quote-unquote pure human line from Adam and Eve. One is dealing with another corrupted line from Adam and the old Jewish tradition of Lilith, who, as it turns out in the Sumerian genealogies that Gardner reproduces, turns out to be one of these members of this pantheon of gods. She's actually the daughter of a very nefarious character. And then another of these individuals, another very popular Sumerian god by the name of Enki, turns out to be the spouse also of Eve. So you have three different lines. And in that context, then, this whole idea that you find in the Sumerian myths and legends takes on kind of a new significance, because the war of the gods, you're dealing with these three lines, and that's a situation tailor-made for strife and conflict. And I think somewhere this aspect of things fits into this larger picture of a cosmic war.
Well, it's been going on for a long time.
Oh, yes, that's precisely the point. And, I mentioned this fact in the introduction to Cosmic War, that when I say war, I don't mean something that is of just a few years' duration. I mean something that is very, very old. It has at least two significant benchmarks if we look at Van Flanderen's exploded planet hypothesis, and that it has been going on literally for millennia. And even when it doesn't appear to be going on, it seems to kind of go underground, as it were, and take less obvious forms.
Well, what you said about the three different lines. We're told, if you read Scripture, that God created the hosts of heaven. We're not told who those hosts are, how many they are, what their function exactly is, But we know that a certain portion of them, Scripture says a third, fell. They rebelled. So there we have this war between this side and that side. And my goodness, that was going on right before or right at that time of the creation.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned rebellion, because one of the things that I point out in the Giza Death Star Destroyed is that if you look at the face on Mars from a certain point of view, in other words, as if you were standing on the surface of the planet itself and then looking off in the distance toward it and seeing it in profile, it looks almost exactly like the profile on ancient Babylonian and Sumerian artwork and friezes of a Sumerian god by the name of Nergal. And Nergal is an interesting character once you start digging into him, because he just so happens to be the Babylonian god of Mars. And as such, he is also the god of war, of fire, and interestingly enough, it's a certain kind of war that he is the god of. It's the war or god of rebellion.
Well, he would also be called Ares.
Ares or Heracles or Era in other versions of the Sumerian. Yes, you know, it's or Mars from our modern Roman naming of him. So in other words, we're dealing with the presence within mythology of a certain archetypal image that recurs over and over again, but yet its ties and associations to that planet and to the idea of a war of rebellion is very clear and very strong.
Oh, yeah. And it seems like we're the focal point of it?
I think in some sense or in some aspect we are.
Kind of the war for your hearts, your minds, you know? Like any political thing.
Right.
They want you to believe in them. And anyhow, why was this war fought? I mean, what is it?
Well, with that, may I ask your permission to take a little break, and I'll be back with you in a couple minutes. Is that possible?
Yes. Hold on just a moment.
Okay.
We're going to take a break, folks. Hold on. We're back. Okay.
And we're not telling what we talked about while we were off the air.
We are not telling. Oh, my goodness. Well, when we talk, Joseph, about technology, okay, we have the Tower of Babel, okay? And it's amazing. I mean, everybody's languages were scrambled.
Right.
Now how does that happen unless something happens to the brain?
Right.
And now, the reason I say that is because a while back I had a stroke. And when someone would talk to me, it was like they were talking in a foreign language. And until that cleared itself up,
right.
I had a really difficult time communicating.
Right.
Printed words did not look right. You know, it took intense, many hours of reading, frustration, crying, to break through that. But I knew if I didn't do something, I would lose my language skills.
Right.
So something happened at that Tower of Babel. Is that a weaponry?
Well, I can kind of tie this with the question that you asked before the break, and that was what caused this war.
Yeah.
In the Cosmic War, I go into some ancient Egyptian the texts that are almost unknown to most people. They're called the Edfu texts, the Edfu temple texts, and into some Sumerian texts and into some ancient Hurrian texts. Now, I want to point one thing out about my use of texts. One of the criticisms that has often been leveled against Zecharia Sitchin is that his translations are just plain wrong.
Yes.
And I want your listeners to know that I do not rely on any text or translation of a text in the English language that is not done by academics. These are standard translations by academics in the field that I rely on. So my reconstructions are not, from the standpoint of translation, challengeable on that basis, unless they wish to challenge the accuracy of these academics.
Right.
That being said, I also believe that the evidence from those texts is sufficient to indicate that there had to have been an underlying technological explanation or basis for what is being described in them. Regardless of how one tries to translate them, this will just always come out. So I think that on that basis that we have a prima facie case to proceed.
Okay.
In those texts, particularly in the Sumerian texts, what is made clear as the casus belli for this war of the gods is the theft of some object or objects of technology that were called the Tablets of Destinies. And in the Cosmic War, I don't want to give away all of that chapter because it's a very significant chapter in that book. I believe that from the standpoint of a paleophysical or scientific analysis of what these objects were, I've come pretty close to cracking it. But essentially these objects were kind of the software, so to speak, that made these ancient weapons of mass destruction work. Now, to tie that to the Tower of Babel for a moment, in the Giza Death Star series, in particular in Giza Death Star Destroyed, and I reproduce these passages again in the Cosmic War, the Tower of Babel, if one reads the account in the book of Genesis, is described as being something that could reach up to heaven, that would permit man to do whatever he imagined to do.
Yes.
And
very intriguing.
It's a very intriguing comment to make, because obviously the person that is associated with it is a fellow by the name of Nimrod,
right,
who has his own interesting Sumerian associations that I get into in the Cosmic War. So this character is building this tower, whatever it is, and I would have your listeners try and forget, all of those Renaissance paintings that we've seen of absurd stone structures with pulleys and ramps and all of this nonsense that art has portrayed to the popular imagination. Because the key phrase for me in the Genesis passage that describes it is that phrase, a tower which can reach unto heaven, that gives man the ability to do whatever he imagines to do. Now, that tower reaching unto heaven is very similar to a Sumerian description of some of these things that is called the Dur Anki, or the bond heaven-earth, to be quite literal. And incidentally, folks, Sitchin gets that translation right. That's exactly what it means. So the only structure that I can think of in that region of the world that embodies analogies within its dimensions to the geometries and properties of celestial bodies in local space is the Great Pyramid. And if one looks at the other pyramids and ziggurats in that region, and particularly the ziggurats in modern-day Iraq, all of them are constructed with some sort of planetary analogs in mind. And even if we go to the pyramids in Mexico, Teotihuacan, and so on and so forth, again, we find all of these odd analogies to celestial alignments, to planets, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, we're dealing there with civilizations who are legacies of something that was once much more sophisticated, and the only thing that I can think of in terms of an artifact on the Earth that is much more sophisticated than any of these other ruins and artifacts that we have in terms of the number of analogies it makes within its dimensions to local celestial mechanics and geometries is precisely the Great Pyramid. So I speculate that the Tower of Babel itself was precisely a product of a very sophisticated, extremely powerful physics that, like this scalar physics that we were talking about earlier, is capable of being applied in any number of very flexible ways, from planetary destruction to manipulation of emotional states and so on and so forth. And I even reproduce a couple of texts in the Cosmic War that kind of indicate that emotional states were in play in this weaponry. So it looks to me as if the Tower of Babel was actually the eradication not only of a technology, but of a kind of unified religio-scientific language, so to speak, that made that technology possible. Obviously you're not going to have a whole lot of cooperation in completing a project like that if engineer A is speaking one particular language and engineer B sounds like he's speaking gibberish and they can't understand each other.
Oh, no fooling.
Yeah, it's a classical sort of a guerrilla warfare tactic, confuse the enemy and thereby inhibit his decision-making processes and his ability to accomplish his operational goals. So this is what's in play in the Tower of Babel, and again, on this line of speculative interpretation of that particular story, it fits very neatly and snugly into this grander picture of a cosmic war and of a very sophisticated civilization possessing a very sophisticated physics and technology with which to fight that war.
Well, it turned around and bit them because,
yes,
they were scattered all over the earth and nobody could understand anybody, and
right.
Something happened there.
Well, we can extend our speculation along the lines that you've just advanced. If my speculation in coupling the Tower of Babel story somehow to the monuments that are present at Giza, if that speculative coupling is true, then that scattering that occurs at that particular Tower of Babel moment, as I like to call it, which I believe is very, very ancient. I believe it happened millennia prior to the biblical flood. If that's true, then the legacy cultures that scatter themselves around the world that are building these pyramidal structures are going to preserve, and in fact do preserve, some aspect of that once united science, and they really don't even know why anymore they're building these pyramids with all of these planetary analogies. They just do it. But nonetheless, it does offer a kind of a neat and tidy explanation as to why those things should be there and what they ultimately, long ago, might once have been for.
Well, golly, they were planning to use it as a weapon?
Well, no. What I mean by that is I don't believe that all of these pyramidal structures were conceived as weapons. What I mean is that the residue of that once sophisticated science that they took with them, that recalled or remembered that they were building these things somehow to couple to the planets, to the gods, and so on and so forth. That was the legacy that they took with them and embodied in those structures. But the science and physics that made it all work was long, long gone.
Yeah. I would agree with that. Well, it's just like when you go to walk around Chichen Itza.
Right.
On Yucatan. The people that are there today did not build those things.
Right.
When Cortez and Bishop Landra landed there, they asked who built these edifices, and the people said the Toltecs built them.
Right.
Well, Toltec is another word for it. The builders built them. Same in Peru. Machu Picchu.
Right.
Same in Egypt. The people that are there today did not have a hand. Their ancestors did not build those pyramids.
Right, and this is a very significant point that you're bringing out, and that is that these civilizations, regardless of where one looks, from the Vedic manuscripts and legends to Sumeria, to Egypt, to Mesoamerica and South America, all of these cultures refer to themselves precisely as legacies of something that was once much more sophisticated.
Yes.
And, there really is no good standard academic reference or work that is accepted in standard academic circles that has any explanation as to why this is so. You really have to be working in the alternative community to take these things seriously. And, I'm one of those that, does take them seriously and then goes on to ask the question, well, if all of these things are true, then do those texts describe, or can they be used to show analogies to any sort of sophisticated modern scientific theory that could possibly be extrapolated or weaponized? And in every case that I have examined thus far, I think the answer to that has to be yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a whopper when you really stop and think about it.
Well, this technology that they had back then, it could literally explode a planet.
Yes, my belief is that it could, yes. Because, again, what we're dealing with, if we're dealing with a physics that can manipulate the fabric of space and time itself so as to stress it or rarefy it, then yes, you are dealing with a potential that, if weaponized, you could explode a planet, a star, you name it. Whatever it is that you want to explode, if you have enough power to load into it, and if that body cannot damp that power, it will explode.
Gives a new take on what in the book of Revelation, where it says, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Well, and in the pseudepigrapha, I hate that, I call it pseudepigrapha. In volume 1, in the book of Enoch, and it's a 2-volume set. It was edited by James H. Charlesworth, put out by Doubleday.
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
Okay.
That set. I don't possess it, but I'm familiar with it.
Oh, it's well worth getting, let me tell you. Very thought-provoking material in here. But they talk extensively about there's different versions of Enoch, like
yes, that's quite true.
The Hebrew, the Slavonic,
right?
Very old, but not as old, I don't think, as the scriptures or the Sumerian text.
Right.
It's just, there's a lot in here that leads somebody to really look at genetic manipulation.
Yes.
And there's a mention of the angel of ice, that Enoch was escorted by the angel of ice. He had to be cooled down, kept cool on his journey into the heavens. And it is a statement that the earth was open unto the third heaven, way back, at the beginning. What does that mean, Joseph? I mean, are they talking, like when you have a radio and you change the frequency and you go to it, you bring in a different station.
Right.
I mean, are we talking about, that's a kindergartner way to express it, but I mean, changing the frequency, like opening up our Faraday cage, if you will, so we can come and go. What do you think? What's your best guess?
Well, I would have to study those texts in more detail than I have, but I'm willing to wager that when we're dealing with expressions, particularly in Judeo-Christian pseudepigraphal works, that we, that we are dealing with expressions that possibly have some sort of astronomical meaning. And if so, then they would have to be very carefully studied and unpacked to figure out what that meaning was. That would be about as far as I'd be willing to go at this juncture. But again, that study, to a certain extent, was undertaken by Giorgio de Santillana and Herta von Dechant in a very famous book called Hamlet's Mill. And that's definitely one that anybody interested in this area of paleophysics should read and investigate very carefully, because it really was the first attempt, and by two very well-known academics, incidentally, to go outside the paradigms of standard academics and look at these ancient myths in an entirely different way, as containing the germs or grains of an underlying science. So my suspicion is, given the fact that so much else from that area of the world and its literature has these sorts of astronomical and scientific allusions, it would not surprise me that the very same has to hold true for some of these ancient Hebrew texts.
Yeah, well, it is utterly fascinating material and extremely thought-provoking.
To add one comment to that, the reason I do not go at great length into examination of the Old Testament, or for that matter of the Old Testament pseudepigrapha and writings of that sort, is that I do realize that it is such a touchy area.
Oh, yeah.
And I am not entirely satisfied myself that I have, in my own private notes and so on and so forth, come up with an adequate paradigm theologically by which to do that, in order to maintain, on the one hand, what those texts might actually be saying, and on the other hand, to maintain the necessary doctrinal tenets of Christian orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. It is a very, very complex subject and has to be handled very, very carefully. I suppose eventually I'll get around to doing it, it's just I'm not prepared to do so or to speak much on it right now.
Oh boy, we are going to be in touch. Because I have a lot of questions on those texts. Oh my goodness. Well, okay, the Celts.
Uh-huh.
They were said to be very big people, very tall and blonde.
Yes.
Okay. A lot of people that have claimed that they've been had encounters.
Right.
With very tall blondes.
Blondes, right.
That they have seen them aboard craft.
Right.
Where they believe, that the person believes they have been abducted.
Right.
Okay, what do we know about these Celts?
Well, this, again, is from that chapter of the Cosmic War where I talk specifically about the problem of giants and giant remains. And it's interesting that you raise the abductee and contactee experience within ufology in that regard, because one of the most interesting things, I think, in terms of some of the ancient North and South American Indian tribal legends is, particularly in the case of the Mayans and the Inca, their creator gods, Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, are both described as being tall and either red or blonde-haired, bearded, and blue-eyed.
Yes.
And this is hardly coincidental. And again, you find similar types of legends even amongst the Japanese with the Ainu people or the Yamato people, and what they say are their own origins. And you find it again even with some of the Vedic texts and so on and so forth. So this is not something that is easily explainable. But the Celts, obviously, were the tribe or group of people, Caucasoid-type race, that inhabited ancient France and then concurrently areas of modern-day Ireland and Britain. And they were said to be giants, and their cousins across the Rhine, the Germans or the Teutons, were said to be even taller and even fiercer, as warriors and so on and so forth. So the Celts fit into this, I think, as do the Germans and some of their legends and so on, as yet just another piece in this horribly complex but very intricately related puzzle, that if there was this giant race on Earth, and apparently there was, because most of these legends speak about that race.
Right.
And if there was an exploded planet of a sufficient gravity to cause physiologies to be that much bigger, and if in turn many of these legends also speak about the so-called sons of God coming down from heaven, and meaning it literally,
Yeah.
not just a spiritual metaphor for bad people doing bad things,
Right.
then we are probably in the presence of different aspects of the same picture. And I think, I do not get in. I want to stress this. I do not get into how all of these different tribes got where they are.
Right.
Nor do I get into explanations of why their various mythologies differ in certain details. I'm simply pointing out the very, very broad picture that all of these things seem to corroborate the basic outline of this vast cosmic war that once took place in our own celestial neighborhood.
Well, it is, without a doubt, the most fascinating topic.
Oh, yes, I would agree.
The counts were, in Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews, there's a very interesting account when Jacob came into Egypt. It was noticed that his legs were huge. Off the coast of Chile, way back, I guess, in the times of Viracocha, I don't know. I can't remember. I think it comes from the Golden Legends. Some men landed. They had a ship, and they landed there, and they were said to have been very, very tall, blonde-haired, and that one of their legs was as tall as the tallest man in the tribe there in Chile.
Right.
There's just voluminous accounts of these things.
Oh, yes, they're all over the world.
Yeah.
They're all over the world. And, this only to my mind cements the case that we're in the presence of some underlying unified phenomenon, and that there is an underlying basis in some sort of society that was itself more or less culturally unified. So, again, to my mind, we just really have to jettison most of the academic picture of human origins in prehistory and begin anew and reconstruct this thing very slowly and very carefully. And here's the rub. It is a massively interdisciplinary effort that is required. It requires, so many disparate kinds of evidence, textual, archeological, biological, scientific, physics, astronomy, and so on and so forth, and certainly a facility with ancient legends and myths, and for that matter, a very thorough acquaintance with the more major streams or traditions within esotericism as well. And, to pull it all together is truly a massive effort. All I do in the Cosmic War, and it's a book of 426 pages, I think. All I do in that book is really outline a very broad case. I do not attempt to fill in the fine details at all. I don't believe that we're, God bless Zechariah Sitchin for having attempted to fill in all the tiny little details.
Yeah.
But I don't think that we can even do that yet. I don't think that we've sufficiently outlined the broad picture well enough to be able to fill in those details.
Right. Well, something happened.
Oh yes, definitely.
And
there was a war and a planet was blown up.
Yeah.
That's a big something.
Well, how did which is it, Joseph? Is it that has which planet? Mars that or Mercury that has a big dent in it?
That's Mars.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the things I point out in the Cosmic War is that there is, in many of these ancient legends, the legend of the scarred warrior. Mm-hmm. And of course, Mars is the planet that we, by legend, in so many different cultures, and within astrological lore and so on and so forth that we associate with war. And, again, my hypothesis kind of begins where Richard Hoagland's ends, in that I believe it was a component or a participant in that ancient cosmic war. And there is a feature on Mars that is called the Valet Marineris. And and I have a picture of this in the book. If one looks at this geological feature, it is visible from space. And in fact, with a very strong telescope, you can see it. It is a massive, huge, scarring, almost straight line valley, or even better put, a kind of a Grand Canyon on an exponential scale. It's just a gigantic geological feature, and it stretches almost all the way across one entire hemisphere of the planet, and it's almost in a completely straight line if you look at this thing. And there really is not a good standard geological model for why this feature should exist. And moreover, if you talk to plasma physicists who are examining some of these features on various planets, one of them, Wallace Thornhill, I believe, has come right out and said that there is no other explanation for this feature on Mars other than a massively huge plasma discharge, which, to put it in layman's terms, a lightning strike that literally gouged this feature out of the planet. Now, lightning strikes don't occur naturally in more or less straight lines. And it's this feature I find most disturbing, because, again, it would point to some sort of artificial origin for it.
What are the chances of Mercury having bumped into Mars?
Again, I'm not a catastrophist. I just, from Immanuel Velikovsky on, and I'm not trying to disparage their work. They did an enormous amount of work and an enormous amount of good in their reconstruction of ancient texts from the standpoint of modern science. So when I say this, I'm not trying to denigrate their work. It's just that I don't find planetary collisions and so on to be a sufficient explanation, simply because the celestial mechanics of our current solar system do not appear to me to be broken enough to indicate those types of incidents. I just don't see it. The orbit that is the strangest of all the planets in the solar system is precisely Mars, and it's accountable for the fact that it might have once been a satellite of that now missing planet where the asteroid belt now is. So I just don't see collisions as a necessary or even plausible model, because, again, if we have large celestial bodies entering the solar system and colliding with planets that are in the solar system, that event will leave little ripple effects on all of the orbits of all of the celestial bodies in the solar system. Again, it's like throwing a rock into a pond. That ripple effect is going to be traceable. And I just don't see the eccentricities are simply not there for catastrophism to work as a model for explaining all of these things. And that's just, that's my opinion, just looking at it from the standpoint not so much of a trained professional scientist, but simply as kind of an amateur scientist, but someone who also has some academic training in the reading of texts. I just don't see these interpretations, and that leads me to kind of another subject, if I can have your indulgence.
Oh, you bet.
One of the things I talk about in the Cosmic War is I devote a whole chapter to what I call catastrophism, and the chapter is entitled The Catastrophe of Catastrophism. And in it I examine the works of Alan Alford, who is a very scholarly man who has certainly consulted just a phenomenally wide range of texts. And I use him as sort of a foil for the catastrophist school. which in his hands he reads all expressions of a chimerical or metaphorical nature that describe any sort of a hybrid in ancient texts as being nothing but a metaphor for this exploded planet. And this is the case even in expressions of the New Testament. Christ himself, in his own interpretation, becomes nothing but a metaphor for an exploded planet cult. And then he kind of ends the quotation that I cite in the book with "the mind boggles." And I begin at that point and say, yes, indeed, the mind does boggle. Because that is such a ridiculous explanation on the face of it to anyone who has even a smattering of acquaintance with early church history. It simply doesn't wash. And on the other hand, if we look at all such expressions in ancient texts as being nothing but metaphors for an exploded planet, then we have really put ourselves in the position that, the old Christian apologist C.S. Lewis said, if you see through everything, you end up seeing nothing at all. And this is where catastrophism fails, because it wants naturalistic explanations for everything. And the texts themselves do not give naturalistic explanations for these things. The texts themselves say that these things were the result either of the wars of the gods, the judgments of the gods or of God, or what have you. There are very specific intelligences involved, in other words, and that implies, once again, that we must take seriously the evidences that those texts provide as to the technology that may have made it possible. So in my mind, catastrophism of any school is, once again, a misdirection. And I would even be willing to entertain the idea or the speculation that it might be an intentional misdirection, while those who are interested in recovering that technology go off and do so.
Yeah. Well, my goodness.
Yeah, that was a mouthful.
Yeah, it sure was, and well said. You talk about large-scale auroral effects.
Uh-huh.
Okay, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, one of the most interesting things, I think, in modern science is a plasma physicist by the name of Anthony Peratt. And he's actually a scientist with Lawrence Livermore Laboratories. He's been a guest scientist at the Royal Stockholm Institute and the Max Planck Institute in Germany and so on and so forth. He's a very, very well-known, well-respected scientist within the plasma physics community. And he noticed that ancient North American Indian petroglyphs, these little kind of stickman figures that you encounter on rocks in the American Southwest or in some cases in the upper Midwest here, that these little stick figures have oddly peculiar resemblances to plasma discharge structures that one can reproduce in the laboratory. And in the book, I have pictures of the shapes of some of these discharges compared to some of these petroglyphs that are, 10, 20,000 years old. And Peratt has actually published a couple of papers in peer-reviewed journals where he is arguing the case that ancient man may have recorded his observation of some of these very large auroral or plasma displays and discharges because he observed them.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things, if you pick it up from there, as do some other scientists, and then go back and look at the depictions of the so-called divine thunderbolts of Zeus, or the divine weapon or arrow of Ninurta in Assyria, in Babylon. And if you look at the artistic descriptions of these things, they too bear uncanny resemblances to these plasma discharges. So in other words, we have yet again, from an entirely different angle in modern science, the corroboration of the idea that these weapons and technologies that were described in the ancient texts have an actual scientific basis. And in this case, we're not, with Peratt, We are not dealing with some New Age prognosticator dreaming these things up. This man has published these observations in peer-reviewed journals.
Wow.
Yeah, it's breathtaking stuff.
Yeah, it is. It really. Well, there's so much, Joseph.
There is.
That we don't know.
Yes.
And I kind of look at, the book of Revelation, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If people want to know what lies ahead,
mm-hmm.
they need to read the book of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we will enter another time of Genesis.
Right.
Basically, that's what the book of Revelation at the end there talks about. And, the restoration of the planets and kind of getting rid of a lot of things that are not useful, as it were, or needed, might be a nicer world.
Yeah, it might be. I tend to think it probably would be.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, I'll vote for a Democrat. He'll fix it. That mentality just, it just slays me.
Yeah, it does me too. It does me too.
Oh, Joseph, well, I kept you long enough. Well, not really. I just keep talking to you forever. Give out the information.
Sure.
How people can get a hold of your book.
Well, my preference, if your listeners want to get my books, is they can try and get them through their local Borders or Barnes & Noble, or directly through my publisher, which is Adventures Unlimited Press.
Yeah, they're good people.
Yes, they are. And unlike certain large internet book-selling companies, you will be able to talk in each case with a real human being who will try and get your order filled. The publisher is Adventures Unlimited Press, and their number is 1-800-718-4514, or online at www.adventuresunlimitedpress, that's all one word, and it's all lowercase, .com. The books are all $16.95 each, with the exception of the Cosmic War, that's $18.95, and the publisher does have a 10% discount on orders of 3 or more books. But let's keep our jobs in this country, folks. Go to Barnes and Noble or Borders or directly to the publisher and get the books there.
Amen. You're right. Let's keep our jobs in this country. Oh, I love it. Everybody, you can go to also Giza, Giza, deathstar.com. You can email Joseph P. Farrell at Vardas, and that's V as in Victor, ARDAS3, the number 3, at AOL.com. Go to thebiteshow.com, click on the audio library. When you get in there, you'll find Joseph's name, Joseph Farrell, and click on his name, and his page will open up with the names of his books, how you can get them, and the audio series that we're doing. And it is an exciting series. I thank you immensely, Joseph.
Oh, my pleasure.
For the labor that you've put into this. Oh, my gosh. And you're really a guy after my heart with this classical music. That you are a composer.
Yeah, I've written a few little concerti for harpsichord and string orchestra.
Wow. Fantastic. Okay, everybody. God bless you all out there for listening. Get Joseph's books. I'm telling you, they are stunning. They are stunning. They'll keep you up at night. So you won't be able to put them down. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes with Joseph P. Farrell signing off tonight, and God willing, we will be back. Good night, everybody.
The Bite Show is listener supported at thebiteshow.com. Follow us on Twitter at The Bite Show.